Chapter 12. Pat Stevens was completely winded and thoroughly angry when he reached the grove where he'd left his two horses. The roan snorted up and bent his ears forward inquiringly as Pat panted up. Pat caught the dragon reins and led the roan back towards the pack saddle bay, explaining over his shoulder. "Take it easy, horse. You've had your riding for today." He swiftly stripped the saddle from the roan, unfastened the cumbersome pack saddle, and shifted it from the bay to the roan. He threw his saddle on the bay mare and slid the bridle off the roan's head and gave him a slap on the haunches and said, "You can take out from home any time you want." The roan snorted and trotted away, shaking himself uneasily under the lightly burdened pack saddle. Pat knew he would make his way back to the Lazy Mare Ranch in a day or so, and for the job ahead of him, he needed the bay mare. She was fresher than the roan, for one reason, having carried only the light pack saddle this far, and she was older and more trail-wise than the roan, a sure-footed mountain horse who knew her way around rough going. And there was plenty of rough going ahead. Pat had figured it all out as he ran from the cabin to his horses. It was wholly useless to try and catch up with Sam and Ezra in time for Sam to make his first Pony Express ride. Their horses had had good feed and rest at the Windrow cabin, and they were at least 4 miles with a head start ahead of him. And even if he did succeed in catching up with them, he'd have the same difficulty he had met when trying to make a frontal approach on the cabin. They'd never let him get close enough to recognize him. If he persisted in following them, Pat knew they'd start shooting in earnest next time. His only chance was to head them off, and that was a wild and dangerous chance, but he was determined to take it. He knew the route the two men would take, knew just about the speed that they would ride at. They were circling the base of the mountain westward through a rough terrain cut up by deep gulches and sharp hogbacks. Long ago, a trail had led directly over the top of the mountain and down the other side, cutting off at least half the distance Sam and Ezra would have to cover in their circulous route. On this side of the mountain, the trail was steep and rocky but passable. The other end of it was broken off by a rock slide that had left a sheer expanse of broken shale with a mountain of pile-up and jagged rocks at the bottom, waiting to receive any horse or rider foolhardy enough to attempt to negotiate the expanse of the slippery shale. Pat knew the danger of that route perfectly well. He and Sam and Ezra had discovered the rock slide the preceding fall while hunting in this region. They had discussed the danger of it at the time, had searched for an alternative route to get down off the mountain, and had reluctantly turned back rather than attempt to descend. Yet Pat knew that was his only possible chance to head off his two friends, and if he could cross the mountain while they were circling the base of it, he could reach a point ahead of them on the safer side of the trail that they were following. He adjusted the bridle to fit the bay's head and stepped into the saddle. She ambled forward as soon as his weight was solidly into the saddle. He turned her sharply to the left and put her down into the canyon and across the spring-fed stream of water, and then lifted her into an easy gallop, circling slightly up the mountain to hit the trail leading almost straight up. Sam and Ezra were well out of sight now, though they might see him later from below as he was nearing the top. He wasn't worried about that. He knew what their reaction would be. If they saw him spurring up that steep trail, they would just grin and tell each other that some fool who didn't know about the rock slide blocked the other end of the trail. They would ride on their own good speed. Sure, the rider would have to turn back upon reaching the slide area. Pat knew he wasn't going to be turning back. He had to try. The bay mare would make it, if any horse in Colorado could. If she didn't, if she lost her footing on that treacherous trail and her and her rider went hurtling down on those jagged rocks below, well, that was the kind of chance a man had to take. He pulled her down gently to a walk. When they reached the trail that was leading directly up, he turned her into it and gave her loose rein, leaning far forward in the saddle to throw as much of his weight as possible upon her withers. She scrambled up nimbly at a half trot and a half walk, her head stretched out far at the end of her neck to give her added balance, her hind legs working like pistons and doing their lifting, while her 4 feet sought out for solid places in the trail just beneath her descended nostrils. This was a trick of horseback riding in the mountains. There must be a complete understanding and coordination between the horse and rider, with absolute trust between them. The rider must be willing to give the animal a free rein and completely have freedom of decision. He must be able to trust himself unreservingly to his judgment of his mount, swaying to this side or that with the movement beneath him, encouraging the animal by his own lack of fear. Pat and the mare were like that together. They knew and trusted each other, and Pat had never asked the mare to do anything that she couldn't do, and thus she was eager to try anything he put her up to. The upward trail was one that would have frightened many horses and men, would have taxed the agility of 98 horses out of 100, even among those bred in the mountainous country. But the mare went up unfaltering, and as they neared the top, Pat began to scan the lower mountain side for the sight of the 2 men he had hoped to intercept. He spied them, after a time, far below and just about where he expected them to be, 2 moving dots against the background of green foliage. They were traveling easy, as though of having no fear of pursuit, and Pat wondered if they had seen him yet. If they did, they reacted just as he had expected them to, trusting the rock slide to stop him. They didn't increase their pace and were still going around at a slow trot when he topped over the mountain, and they were cut off from his view. Pat pulled the mare to a stop as soon as they were out of Sam and Ezra's sight. She was heaving from terrific exertion of the climb, drawing in great labored breaths of that thin mountain air, and her red coat was streaked with sweat, spotted here and there with white froth that was blown back from her mouth. Pat got off her and stood by her, patted her neck and fondled her ears, while his grim gaze followed the narrow path downward to the point where there was no more trail. The upper edge of the slide was almost a half-mile below, a couple miles in width, and extending downward several 100 yards to the bottom. Bright sunlight was reflecting upward from the smooth shale surface, and from this distance it appeared there had not been a single foothold in the entire slide area for a man or animal. Pat knew it was not quite as bad as that. Shale is formed in uneven layers that lay practically parallel to the slope of the hill in which they form. In a slide, the layers break off unevenly, leaving small crevices and ridges which look strong enough to hold a considerable weight. The great danger is always that these broken layers will again give way and start another slide that will break away an increasing portion before it, and something that no human being can ever stop once it gets started. Well, take your time and get plumb rested, Pat told the bay mare grimly. You're going to be needing all your strength when you get started down yonder. The mare pricked her ears forward and seemed to be gravely considering the dangers of the slope below. Then she turned and rubbed her wet muzzle against Pat's arm. Her upper lip was drawn away from her teeth as though she was smiling reassuringly to Pat's doubt. He felt some of the tension go out of him, and he rubbed his hands down her forehead and tweaked her nose playfully. All right, if it's so funny, he agreed cheerfully. You and me are going to take a chance at killing ourselves to do a favor to a couple ornery coyotes that was just shooting at me. A couple that ain't worth the powder to blow 'em into hell. You got more sense than that, I bet you. But seeing that you're not arguing about it, if you say so, well, that's good enough for me. The mare tossed her head and whinnied lightly. All right. You're like any other lady I know. She sometimes thinks what I do is all right, too. Kinda puts me plumb ashamed sometimes." He put his foot into the stirrup, swung up into the saddle. "Down we go, and there won't be no stopping when we hit that shale neither." The mare dropped her head low, almost between her forefeet, and began picking her way down daintily. Pat leaned far back into the saddle, bracing his weight against his feet in the stirrups. He kept the reins just tight enough to tell the mare that they remained in his hands, loose enough to give her complete freedom in choosing her own course. It was breathtaking work. Small stones were dislodged by the mare's hooves and clattered on down the steep mountain to the smooth shale, where they shot out at accelerated speed. The mare's breathing was loud, but never once did she hesitate. She seemed to smell out the solid places for her forefeet, and she kept her haunches well under her so that she almost crouched on the sharp decline. As they neared the slide area, Pat began telling her in a calm, conversational tone, "There it is right ahead. Don't try to stop when you get to it. You just keep on going. You can make it. Thing is, just don't be getting scared. If you start slipping, just hold on tight. And don't fight it. You can't fight shale, and you can't go any way but down. And here it is now, straight ahead." He pressed his legs against the mare's ribs as she hesitated for an instant at the edge of the shale. She braced herself and slid her forefeet out onto the smooth surface. They found a small indentation and stopped there. She gathered herself like a bucking horse with all 4 feet close together, and then took a long step forward to another rough spot. Her nose brushed against the rock surface, and it was as though she was gingerly feeling her way upon with her lips. Pat didn't let himself look down. He was braced in the saddle, giving every bit of his concentration and effort to helping the mare by shifting his weight with every movement she made. The sweat dripped from his face as they inched their way down. They were halfway down, almost to a point of safety. If a slide started now, the distance was not so great that they would hit the jagged rocks in the bottom with deadly impetus. And still, the mare went on, sliding 2 feet here, setting herself, and rocking back on a perch so precarious that it looked as though it wouldn't hold a coyote. And now they were down. There were only the broken and tumbled boulders of the rock slide to navigate across the bottom of the choked draw. Pat stopped and sweating and began to breathe easily again. The mare climbed sure-footed around rounded boulders, avoiding the jagged places with an intelligence that was more than human, and finally heaving herself up on the other side of the draw. Pat laughed, bent forward, and patted her sweat-streaked neck. "You're one horse in a million," he told her throatily. "If there's any reward money for the bank, you'll be getting it in oats." He reined her around sharply to the right and lifted her into a gallop. The trail Sam and Ezra were following were about a quarter of a mile ahead. If they had continued at the same pace they were traveling at when he last saw them, they'd still be a couple miles back. He pulled up at the edge of the old trail, leapt off. One glance told him that he was in time. He led the mare back to a thick clump of juniper, left her where she couldn't be spotted from the trail, and then trotted back and looked around for a safe spot where he might accost the 2 riders. He selected a gnarled oak that leaned over the trail, climbing the trunk quickly and inching his way out onto a thick limb to a point directly over the trail. He straddled the limb, relaxed, and smiled a little now that the strain was over. He got out the makins and rolled a cigarette while he listened alertly for his friend's approach. Soon he heard the ring of steel horseshoes on the rocky trail as he lit his cigarette. They were still coming at a leisurely trot, evidently feeling wholly secure in the belief that they had outdistanced him. Pat puffed away on his cigarette with satisfaction and grinned widely when he saw their heads bobbing along under low trees in the distance. There was a huge, heavy-shouldered body of Ezra, towering a foot above his smaller companion. Ezra wore a black Stetson and a dusty blue shirt, but Sam Sloan was gaily attired in a bright red silk shirt and a fresh pair of blue jeans. They were laughing and talking to each other as they approached. He could hear Ezra's booming laughter and could see a grin wreathing the dark, ugly face of Sam Sloan. Pat's belly muscles tightened uncomfortably as he suddenly remembered why he was here. In the excitement of heading them off, he had forgotten that he wanted them for robbing the Dutch Springs Bank and a couple murders. It made him angry to see them joking and laughing so gaily. He had risked a disgrace for their sake last night, and today he had risked his neck just to get close enough to talk to them. He was a damn fool, he told himself morosely. They hadn't thought of him last night when they had done those things that sent them riding the old Owl Out trail. And now they were happy as a couple kids at an ice cream festival, as if murder was something to laugh about, and murdering and robbing their own bank, stealing their friends' money. He was all choked up with a curious blend of anger and of fear as he waited for them to ride beneath the tree. This was the showdown. What happened in the next few minutes would determine whether he could go on living as a respected citizen of Powder Valley, or whether he took out for the border with them. He thought of Sally, and his son Doc, and of Kitty Lane. Then they were directly beneath the limb, and he spoke down to them quietly, without raising his voice. "Where are you hombres heading for?" End of chapter 12.